Confident, confident, confident. I can be confident, 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 confident. I can be confident at work.
Hello and welcome to episode 108 of the Confident at Work podcast. I'm your host and your confidence coach, Anna Manning. Today I have a guest interview with Carolyn Cleveland. So Carolyn talks all about complaints and compassionate, empathetic communication. I learned a lot from this interview with Carolyn, and I already did something differently when I was feeling frustrated editing this episode, and it worked. So the chances are during your professional career, at some point, just like I was, and you'll hear me talk about it in this episode, you will have a complaint made about you. Or maybe you'll even be the person who's making a complaint about somebody else. That being the case, Carolyn and I want to arm you with the emotional component of complaints, the importance of empathy and compassion in dealing with complaints really well, processing the emotions that come with a complaint, because there's a lot, and seeking support, the role your organization could play in supporting you as a professional, and a warning about the impact of a poor internal narrative and what that can do to you if you have a complaint made against you. And I was left with something that blew my mind a bit, actually, which was that a complaint handled really well actually has the power to increase your professional confidence. You might think I'm talking rubbish, so you will have to listen on to find out. And without further ado, I welcome my guest, Carolyn Cleveland, to the podcast.
Thanks, Anna. It's a real pleasure to finally be on one of your brilliant podcasts with you. So thanks for the invite. And as everybody now knows, my name's Carolyn Cleveland and I'm founder of C&C Empathy Training. And my business works with all sorts of professionals, predominantly healthcare professionals, but I go across lots of different sectors, working with complaints, as you said, Anna, but also leadership and resilience and well-being, and it's all very tied in. I'm an NHS approved trainer as well, and also part of the Civility Saves Lives teams as well. So yeah, it's really great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the podcast.
All right, thank you. So can you tell us first off how you ended up here? How did this end up being the thing that you focus on?
Okay, so it has a story that's really very much embedded in my past. I'm the grand age of 55 now, but it started up very much when I was a young woman. And my very good friend very sadly died in a misdiagnosed illness, which sadly led to her untimely death, leaving the care of her 4-year-old daughter, Sophie, in my hands. And I was only 22 at the time. And so I was quite young and suddenly realizing that actually things were not quite as easy as I was hoping they were going to be as a young woman. And I was having to answer some really challenging questions. But what it did in turn is it really made me understand just how complex our emotions are when we're going through any kind of trauma, and also how it can really impact on our own well-being. I brought Sophie up for the next 11 years, had 3 other children as well during that time. And I really found an interest, similar to you, Anna, with coaching. Mine went through counselling, particularly specialising in loss and bereavement counselling and psychology. But then 11 years after Sophie's natural mum had died, very sadly, Sophie got an illness and died herself in hospital in a patient safety incident. And I was suddenly in a position of having to raise a complaint, which still seemed like a very strange word when you're dealing with something so seriously, but that's still how we term these things, a complaint, about her care or lack of, and hit a very challenging defensive system that even used my lack of biological status as a reason not to talk to me. Because of my background in counselling and psychology, I knew the huge benefit of empathic communication, of compassion, of looking after ourselves and psychological safety. And I could see all the places that wasn't present, but thankfully had some tools to at least look after my own well-being as much as I could. Then to talk at conferences about that emotional experience, a real felt experience in 2006. And then in 2015, decided I really wanted to work with professionals where we can really dig deep and really provide an opportunity for them to dig deep, but very safely about the experience of somebody going through a complaint or somebody in a vulnerable situation, but also their own emotions, what's going on for them as well. So I started up CNC empathy training, and it's grown from there. And I feel very privileged working with the people I work with now, but it's all sits very much embedded in that 22-year-old a long time ago, and feeds into what I talk about with people now.
Well, welcome to that 22-year-old, and to you and to Sophie. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I think it speaks really strongly as to why you're doing this. And it's made me think as you were talking, I'll bet that most people at work at some stage in their career are the subject of a complaint. And I'm wondering if most people have the benefit of being able to explore what that's like in a training like yours or in a safe place, or whether for most of us it just lands on the desk and suddenly there's a complaint, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Anna. And of course, as you well know, we have so many unconscious emotions sat under the surface. So intellectually, we could be saying, okay, we have a complaint about us. We need to be looking at this. But emotionally, we're probably feeling defensive. We're feeling criticized. We're feeling angry. We may be having an awful lot going into our funnel of life, which is a model I use in my training, when you've just got so much going in, and sometimes things get stuck and are stuck there for a long time, and this could be that last thing going in, and we're trying to manage all of these things, yet that's clashing often quite violently with this intellectual process that we should know how to deal with it, we should be able to manage it well. But inside, that's not the story that we're feeling, and it's often not what we're telling ourselves. We failed in some way, or we're not a good person. And that can really start to erode our sense of self, can't it?
Yeah. And I guess because of what we think about on this podcast, our confidence as well. If you start to question, can I do this job? Am I good enough to, in this case, look after this patient or work for this client? Or, what does this mean about me? The fact that this complaint has happened. And I guess you've probably seen a full range of understandable emotions. What's the kind of things that you see?
I think I have seen a huge amount of a range of emotions there. And I know also from my own experience, seeing how those emotions were played out. So seeing differences in communication with some of the people that I was in conversations with, and being able to see some of that vulnerability, but then how those things were coming out in letters. It was almost like a different person coming out, because of course there's so many conflicting things going into the mix as well. But both parties, whether it's the person making the complaint or the person receiving the complaint, are human beings, and that is one of the strongest messages that I try to send. We have this human commonality, so each person will be feeling those unconscious feelings, not necessarily knowing where they come from. Each of those people will probably be having their confidence eroded at some point, or they're not feeling worthy enough to be listened to, worthy enough to do their job. In my case, it went as deep as, was I even worthy as a parent? It can really hit into our personal life as well as our professional life. So it can have a massive, massive impact if we're feeling not understood, if we're feeling not valued, and if we start to not understand ourselves, and if we start to not value ourselves, then that's when it can really have a massive impact, as you said, on our confidence.
Yeah, and it struck me there as you were talking, for the person who's making a complaint about something, and for the person who's receiving it, for both of them, that's quite a vulnerable spot to be in, isn't it?
It really is, because both actually have an emotional component. So one of the things I talk to people about is behind every fact that we tend to deal with in life, whatever that fact may be, always sits an emotional component. It has that emotional meaning. And that could be something very simple, could be something very complex, and often is very complex when you peel back the layers. So, somebody could be raising a complaint and they're actually wanting somebody to understand. If we say, for example, somebody's complaining about an energy supplier for their parent, it could potentially be so much more than that. It could be, please, can you listen? My parent is in a vulnerable position. I'm the other end of the country. I'm trying to support them in this. I'm feeling disempowered. I'm feeling guilty that I should be there and I'm not there to do it in a practical sense. Please listen to me. And if that's getting met with a very defensive answer the other end of an email or the telephone, you can see how that can have such an adverse effect on that person, because there's all this emotional component coming towards them, but or from them. But of course, from the person on the other side, they will have their own emotional component as well. And often we rub along with people really very, very well. But of course, if those things clash, that's when we can really get into trouble and difficulty with communication. And hey, let's be honest here. I'm far from perfect, and I get those communications incredibly wrong sometimes, because sometimes I'm more able to understand my emotions because my funnel is less full, and sometimes I'm less able, and it will be afterwards I'll be reflecting and thinking, maybe I shouldn't have said that, or maybe I didn't understand. And so we are all very human, and that's the challenge.
How aware most of the time do you think that person or all of us are of the emotional component that is taking place? Sometimes it feels like maybe that bit is slightly hidden from our view.
I think it's very hidden from our view a lot of the time. I think we're very, very focused on that felt experience, what we're feeling, whether it's frustration in that moment in time, whether it's anger in that moment in time. And we're not necessarily tuned into the fact that I feel scared, or I feel worried or concerned, or incredibly vulnerable. We're feeling that sort of more on the surface emotion, and that's what we're running with often. And we're not necessarily present enough in the moment to start to delve into that. And sometimes people will do it afterwards, but sometimes we just move on to the next thing, don't we? And then we get bombarded with the next.
So, how do you do that then within your, and maybe you can just give us a little snapshot or an example when you're working with somebody and you're helping them think about complaints and sounds like maybe feel about complaints. Is that part of what you do, helping them to become aware of that stuff which might be lurking under the surface, but sounds like it probably is having an impact?
It's exactly what I do. And you've hit the nail on the head, Anna, talking about the fact that I get people to feel about complaints, or if it's about leadership or whatever I'm working with them about, because it's very immersive what I do with people. So part of telling my story, which I tend to do right at the outset of any session that I give, it's to actually evoke people's empathy. It's to evoke people's compassion. It's to evoke their feelings of their own life experiences that will tend to come up. And when people have that, they can then become more open to understanding that it's a lot more complex than what we often think it is. So by taking them down that route to start with, it opens up some of those emotions, but it's very much then the theme that I take them through. If I'm doing a day's training, for example, that as we're analysing some of the content that I give them, we're looking for that next stage down, and maybe that next stage down. And actually, if you were in this position, what might you be feeling in that other person's position? But because they do it, I guess through in part my story, it makes it feel a little bit more psychologically safe for them because they get to dig deep without it actually having the spotlight too much on them, in a group maybe of colleagues in a room, because it's challenging, as you well know, digging deep with emotions sometimes, isn't it? And so doing it through parts of my story and parts of my experience, but of course with the backdrop of counselling and psychology, gives them that ability to feel. And then when new information comes in, but it's then connected with an emotion, it stands much more chance of going into their long-term learning and their long-term memory, because it makes sense to them.
Mm.
I think that's one of the key things. It needs to make sense to them, to their lives, to their experiences. And it's amazing the commonality of discussions that I have from group to group, because we are all human beings. So we will have all had frustration, anger, fear, vulnerability, even if it's wrapped up very differently. I talk about an emotional sort of library that we will all have different experiences. So we'll all have different books in our emotional library. I will have different books in my emotional library, different experiences to what you will, Anna, but we will have common themes in those books. We will all know the feeling or fear of loss. We'll all know the feeling of anger. We'll all know the feeling of happiness, but it may be wrapped up in a very different book in our emotional library. But it's about sometimes honing in on some of those common emotions to understand different perspectives and to understand yourself too. And to believe in our ability to empathize, because often people feel that they haven't easily, maybe as what it used to. They feel that they have lost that ability, but often it's more that they're just putting up some necessary boundaries and defenses around them. So it's in part to try and build that confidence in their own empathic abilities, but by looking after themselves at the same time.
That speaks to something from my own experience. When I was a lawyer, I did medical negligence work. So all of my clients had either a loss of a family member or a serious injury. So all of my shelves, because we had paper files in those days, as I would say on a really bad day, my shelves are filled with misery and death. And I don't think I did this consciously, but I do remember that slowly, I think, I wound some kind of armor around myself in order to deal with that environment, which it did help me to deal with the environment. But I think in the process of that, I lost some of my empathy.
Yeah. And I don't think that's uncommon at all, Anna. And as you said, when you're dealing with situations such as you were, it has such a high amount of unhappiness or misery and death in that situation. And so we are going to try and protect ourselves in whatever way we can. And that's why I think emotional awareness is so important, to recognize that that's what you're needing to do at that moment in time, but also to have those self-care practices in place where we can actually maybe write down how we're feeling. Identifying our feelings and expressing them in some way has a massively strong impact in diminishing the power of negative emotions in our brain. And I know I practiced it hugely when after Sophie died. I wrote about 150,000 words after she died, to try and look after my psychological well-being, because I actually had a fear of hardening up in my grief. If I survived it, who would I be at the end of it? 3 remaining children, and actually wanted a happy life. And so even though it was a very up and down journey, I worked very hard at trying to mitigate that hardening up that we have to do sometimes to cope with those difficulties. And I also believe in laughter a lot as well. I have to bring humour. There's lots of humour in my training sessions, as well as all those big, difficult subjects as well, because I think that enables our brain to process things.
What happens when a complaint, or we are the subject of a complaint, and that hardening has already occurred?
Sadly, often what happens is then the complaint is handled in an uncompassionate and unempathic way, and it creates more harm. It creates second harm, often for people who have already been through a traumatic event, and actually just increases levels of anger and levels of frustration. Crucially, though, I think I need to add here is the onus can't just be on us while we have such a responsibility, personal responsibility for our own well-being and understanding ourselves. Organisations need to have that level of support in there too, and often that's sadly not the case for people going through complaints, particularly very serious ones. They're not supported through the process. There's not that understanding of that emotional component going on there. They're not cared for by the organisation. They're not being given the message to care for themselves from that organisation as strongly as maybe they should be. And that can then make the process so much harder.
And I guess could also get the professional to a place where they lose their motivation, they don't actually want to do the job anymore, they quit, as well as there not being a great response to this complaint, so the other person ends up feeling frustrated, angry. It's bad all round, basically, it sounds like.
It is, and I know I remember when I went through what I went through, and it was 3 years of massively defensive communication and really quite brutal sort of interactions with me. But my final meeting that when I finally got to meet the clinician, we finally got to talk at the end of the meeting as two human beings within the meeting. But it went to a different level, and it was at that point of me being able to see his humanity and the fact that actually he cared. I could actually see that he cared, that I was able to enlist all my humanity for him, and it was at that point that I was able to wish him peace for the rest of his life. But it took that two-way process, and so if somebody is getting very apathetic, somebody is getting very hardened, it tends to break down any chance of that two-way process. But of course, it does need both parties to try and do it as much as possible. If we're hitting brick walls, then it can get really, really challenging. And sadly, empathy is not a magic wand. It's if it solved everything, we'd all be doing it really easily all the time, wouldn't we? And it's not. It doesn't solve every situation because we are so complex as human beings. But it really can make a massive difference when we can understand each other and care about ourselves as well as other people too.
And it sounds like sometimes that's the sort of brave route to take.
Yes, I guess it is. Gosh, you made me kind of really, really think about that from my own perspective, because of course at the time, you feel very vulnerable when you're going through these things. You don't always feel brave, do you? Even though actually you are being very brave under the circumstances, it's not always translated in your emotions as a feeling of bravery. What we would imagine feeling brave, we'd be feeling like we could conquer the world, we're on top of our game, but actually we can be being incredibly brave but almost crawling around on our hands and knees emotionally sometimes, can't we? In fact, that's often when we are our bravest, so we don't always recognize our bravery, but it's the more difficult route sometimes, but actually leads to an easier road long term. I think certainly my overall well-being, and I still will have challenges and dips along the way, as anybody would, but I think my well-being is where it is now because of understanding my emotions, because of trying to be kind to myself, because of trying to understand somebody else's situation, and trying to put myself in their position rather than separating us off into these two different entities, and never the twain shall meet, as they say. That did take bravery on my part to do, because it's much easier just to be angry sometimes, but it's not easier on us long term if we're in that place of anger.
Obviously, you've got loads of experience training professionals, but also that lived experience of being somebody who has cause to make a complaint. What would you offer for the professional who may be the subject of a complaint?
When you say what would I offer, do you mean as in?
Or let me rephrase it. What way of approaching a complaint gets to the best result?
So for the person, if they're reading a complaint, let's say it's about something that they've done, so it's got that personal aspect. I think reading it first of all and allowing yourself to feel those natural feelings that we're going to feel. That's not how I remember it. I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling defensive, I'm feeling attacked, whatever that may be in the situation. You've got no idea what I was going through at the time. All those thoughts and emotions that tend to flood us when we're reading something that we're immediately thinking is very negative. But to also then probably try and unpick that a little bit, to have, and we need an element of sort of emotional awareness to do this well, but to try and think about, okay, is this actually me they're talking about here, or is it the situation they're talking about? What was I going through? With thinking about it in a more compassionate way. What were the other factors that were affecting me? What was I succeeding in that situation, as well as what I maybe wasn't doing as well? And to try and spend some time processing some of that, maybe even with a colleague that knows you well, but may challenge as well as understand you, almost before they even think about what they might respond. Because if they don't do that, what they're often then responding to is, I feel attacked, you said, I say. um, and we're trying to justify situations, and we're trying to get somebody else to understand our situation, because it matters to us, and somebody will possibly feel hurt or betrayed by something we've said or done or harmed, and we may have had a very good reason for doing what we've done in that situation. And so I would always give some time to understand that emotional fallout from that on an immediate level and a slightly deeper level. But also, when you're then reading that complaint again, try and understand what are the facts, but what is the emotional component. So, the facts are that, the dates, the incident, those kind of things. The emotional component is, if we go back to that earlier example, this is somebody who's in Scotland phoning an energy board about their parent in Cornwall. They maybe, because we don't ever know for definite unless somebody shares it with us, they may be feeling completely out of control in this situation, and allow what I call an inquiring mind, allow that inquiring mind and that professional curiosity of what might be the emotional component. So when we're starting to answer, we can have an element of what this person might be feeling. And of course, that just helps us see them as human beings rather than just somebody who's attacking us. Does that answer?
Perfectly. And I like the point that you said you may even require some support to do all of that.
Yeah. Absolutely, because as I said, when we identify our feelings and express them in some way, it does diminish the power of those negative thoughts. But actually, part of that, even though we can achieve things through writing things down, having somebody who is going to listen, who's not going to judge, but might challenge some of the things we're saying can really help us understand ourselves better. Because when we're actually verbalizing things, we can understand, it gets to that point where we can actually understand, yeah, actually, this is what I'm feeling, not this. I'm actually feeling angry about this rather than something else. So it helps us untangle some of those things. And if we've got somebody who we trust and is supportive, then that can be such a massive plus for us in that process. And of course, we feel less alone as well, don't we?
Mm-hmm. So before we try and do anything or we try and respond, read a complaint, read our own response to it, our own emotional reaction, think about what might be underneath that or in that for us, and maybe even get some support to help us before we move to no, this, not this, I did that, which it's so tempting, isn't it?
It is, and I think one of the things I try and talk to people about is not trying to have the absence of things. So not trying to have the absence of biases or labeling or negative self-talk or challenging emotions, because we can't ever get to that point. We will have them. And so it's almost rather accepting we do have biases. What are they? Do we know what they are? Are we using them in a way that's judging somebody else? Are we labeling? If we never labeled anybody, we'd leave ourselves in all sorts of difficult and dangerous situations. We need to have some way to code and understand what's going on in that moment, but be aware of how you're labeling and challenge that label if actually you are joining that with a bias and being very judgmental or hurtful. If we're having those emotions of feeling attacked and defensive and angry, that's okay. We are allowed to feel these things, but then allow ourselves to go to the next step as well. So doing it all in a conscious way and showing ourselves some self-compassion along the route as well, so that we can actually do the best we can rather than actually trying to be perfect, because none of us are. And we need to embrace all that we are if we're going to actually grow and develop in the process.
And it sounds like if we're going to deal with a complaint really well, we have to be willing to embrace all that we are, that throws up for us.
We do, absolutely. And also embrace that the person who's making that complaint is as complex and going through all of those things. And of course, sometimes people will be at both of these positions with different levels of tools available to them, different life experiences, different levels of emotional awareness or intelligence in that situation, different levels of support around them. I was really lucky when I went through what I went through. I'd had my background, I'd had a strong level of training. I'd had to do a whole year in self-development just to do my counselling, as painful as that was. But it gave me a strong foundation. I also had a really good support network around me. And I also had quite a naturally positive outlook where I was able to reframe things relatively easily throughout my life. That's just something that just I felt quite able to do. And some people will not have all of those, or won't have one of those. They may struggle with the level of support they've got around them. They may not be able to reframe things to see the good in something. They're probably seeing the challenges in something. And so everybody's coming with those differences, aren't they? And that can be a real challenge.
Yeah, and isn't it great that we just think we're dealing with some facts on a page, and actually what we're dealing with is all of these different people and all of their feelings about things and their thoughts and their biases and their lenses, and no wonder if he's sometimes getting a pickle with it.
Absolutely. Do you know what? One of the things that really stood out to me when I was back in my young days, when I was about 23 doing my counselling, and I'd not long started, and my lecturer said to me, "Let me see if I can remember this properly. If you can find the courage to sit with somebody's distress long enough, you not only validate their situation, but without knowing it, sometimes you may validate their entire life." And that was a real light bulb moment for me, and I really, it resonated with me when I was then going through my complaint over Sophie's death. That actually, when people were sitting with my distress for long enough, when they had the courage to do that for long enough, they were in fact validating probably not all of my life, but a big chunk of my life. I was 33 when Sophie died. I was 18 when she'd been born. And that was a long time, and we'd gone through some very, very big things together. And so somebody sitting, having the courage to sit with that distress long enough, didn't just validate the complaint, they validated all of those years, and that's the power of it, but the challenge all at the same time.
And that speaks to the potential power that there is in the moment where somebody has cause to make a complaint. Actually, it sounds like, as well as the possibility for things to be done badly, there's an amazing possibility and a power for healing, for growth, for understanding. Can you speak to that?
There's a massive possibility. One of the really simple exercises I do with people is thinking about a situation when somebody has actually really listened to what they've had to say, and it could be professional, it could be personal, it could be a friend that's just really kind of really listened and understood them. Doesn't matter what the situation is. What I ask them to do is to think about the emotions, tease out some of those emotions of that felt experience, and without fail, every single time, no matter what group of people I'm working with, at whatever level, it will be, I feel important, I feel cared for, I feel validated, I feel valued, I don't feel judged, all of those really positive things. And conversely, if they sort of flip it over, and sometimes they're talking about when that hasn't happened, it will have, "I don't feel I mattered to somebody. I don't feel like anybody cared. I felt really judged." And you get those very opposite emotions. And when they've gone through this, that's when I say, look at the difference you make. You've not probably fixed anything. You've not changed anything. It may be the same situation, and it could be a really dire situation, but that's the power that you have just had in creating all of those positive emotions for another person. Don't lose sight of that, because it can often feel that we're not doing enough if we can't solve a situation, particularly if it's a really challenging situation, particularly if it's involving, loss or harm of some description. But actually, there's so many things that we can do that is really powerful. And it's part of my job is, yes, skilling people up in certain ways, but it's reminding them of what they can achieve and what they often do achieve without even giving it any airtime at all, because they're too busy telling themselves of all the things they haven't done. And so it's that, I think that's really important to recognize, not just what happens when we don't do it, but what is happening each and every time we are doing it. Even if
Yeah.
we're not getting the response from the person that we might actually want, maybe they're not able to accept it, maybe they're not able to receive it at that moment in time. But that doesn't take away from what we've actually given the opportunity of.
And that makes me think, I wonder if at the very beginning of a process like that, if you could be taken forward into the future and say, in a calm moment, no matter how this turns out, if you could look back and know that you were really proud of how you showed up and how you tried to handle it, what would you do? What approach would you take?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so powerful, isn't it? If we can step into the future and think back um, about how we would feel, and it's something that again resonates with me very strongly, because for all the guilt that I felt along the way, it's something that I know has kept me sane all these years later, because I can look back and know that I handled something well. There's a few things that I didn't handle so well, but in general, I have that, and that has a real strong impact with our confidence, and that's what I really try to instill with professionals that I work with, that actually they need to have that too. That's important for them as well.
Yeah, so the complaint even, or this moment of complaint might even result in an increase to somebody's professional confidence, not a diminishing of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the people, strange, well, not strangely, but it's not strange to me because it makes sense to me. But often the people who start off as somebody who we feel is very against us can end up being our champions, because of how we've managed a situation. They see that, they recognize us as human beings, and so even though we think somebody isn't going to like us or is angry with us, um, if we're able to connect with them emotionally, and we're able to do the very best that we can in that situation, and that's somebody's able to see that, it can really have a strong implication um, on our that person's relationship, how they're viewing us, as well as how we view ourselves as well.
There was one thing I wanted to ask you about, which was, you talk about the power of empathetic communication on this whole process. So if something's gone wrong or if there's a complaint. And a lot of the work that I do is helping people to recognize and potentially change their own internal communication. Because often when we're working with confidence, what we find is that the internal narrative is harsh, critical, demanding, just difficult. And in the moment when there's something like a complaint or something's gone wrong, that kind of internal narrative can go into overdrive. Do you think it's important in getting this right that someone's internal narrative isn't giving them such a hard time? Or what happens when they do?
I think it's really important that we are aware of our internal narrative, so dominated by that sort of negative bias and how we talk to ourselves. So I think it's massively important, and I think it really feeds in to what we're communicating, because if we're talking badly to ourselves, that affects our emotions, and we've got much more chance. If I'm feeling really bad about myself, and I'm giving myself a really hard time, and I'm feeling like I'm failing in nearly everything I'm doing, you can bet anything that I'm going to be less able probably to switch on my empathy to its full ability. I'm probably going to snap at somebody. I'm probably going to have less patience with somebody, because I'm not feeling great in that moment in time. And so we need to recognize that internal voice, and it is one of it's our most important voice, and it's the one we listen to the most.
When I was in my old job, I had a complaint. It couldn't be addressed as a formal complaint because the person wished to remain anonymous. And they'd called and spoken to somebody in a particular team, randomly happened to be the IT team. And they were asked, would you like to be put through to, my boss or somebody else so that we could, take the information? And they said no, but kind of here's what we're thinking, here's what the complaint is. And I found it really tricky to deal with. I didn't have to respond because there was nobody to respond to. But I think the thing that I found really hard was a sense of embarrassment that somebody from the IT team had taken this call. There was this complaint about me that they now knew about. They'd taken that to my boss. My boss had taken it appropriately, and recorded it in a central system. So everybody every month who hears about every complaint now knows all about that. And this was new me, right? So in an old world, it would have been very different. I was able to say, okay, I wonder what it was that person actually really needed to say that I might need to hear. Because I'd now got the skills, I was able to do that. But there was this real sense of what felt like just mortified, like embarrassment, that I found really tricky to deal with at the time.
And that embarrassment often comes even when we've got strong confidence and strong self-worth, because it clashes with that, doesn't it? Because it can be feeling, we may have these things, we may have our confidence, we may have our self-worth, but it can feel very vulnerable sometimes and even very transient sometimes. And then we are dealing with something such as you just explained, and all of a sudden we can be feeling a fraud, we can be feeling, as you said, embarrassed, because people are going to be looking at us differently, you're looking at yourself differently, and that then really can start to erode who we are. And it is having those skills to stay in that inquiring mind, to be able to ask those questions. I wonder what this person might need to say to me, rather than, well, why is this person making this complaint and I don't understand this, and now I'm feeling embarrassed and I'm feeling outed in front of everybody, and I've worked hard on my professionalism, and now suddenly it's out there for everybody to look at and laugh at, and that's unlikely to have ever been the case, but it's how we then start to interpret it, isn't it? This is what's going to happen in this particular scenario, because that's how we're feeling about ourselves. So having that questioning, having that sort of openness and inquiring mind to go in with a question about the situation, can put us in a different place to start to process that information, because our emotions will respond to those thoughts that we've got, won't they? So you put yourself in a really good position to see something in, you weren't judging this person in that moment in time, you were trying to understand that person in that moment in time, despite the challenging feelings that you had. I wonder what this person might need to tell me that I need to hear. So you're trying to understand that person, and that will be of benefit to you. Does that
Yeah, and
resonate?
actually, yeah, it does. And I think just even sharing that, the fact that that happened, that feels a bit vulnerable. But hopefully, if people listening to the podcast are like, oh, someone actually made a complaint about me, or I've had a complaint, or even I've had to complain about something, this is actually a normal experience that we're going to have in life.
Yeah.
So rather that my feeling was, oh, nobody should know about this. This is so embarrassing. But actually, if nobody talks about it and we all think this is so embarrassing, we're going to try and hide it and cover it up, that just perpetuates the problem, right?
It does, because we will upset people, we will do things that might hurt somebody else, and actually part of looking after ourselves is sometimes putting up boundaries that somebody might actually find difficult or challenging, and so all of those things will be going on in the situation that we're dealing with as well. And it's a little bit like, I always used to talk about this when my children were all at primary school, and my two youngest are twins, and they were a handful, to say the least. And I would turn up at school in the morning, sometimes utterly frazzled, but just hear everybody go, "Morning, how are we? Yes, all fine, thank you." And inside, I'm thinking, no, I'm fit to burst this morning, because I've been asking them to put on their shoes for half an hour, and I'm still putting them on when they're in the car. And, my emotions are about to explode, but we're suddenly setting up this scene as soon as we walk through those gates, those school gates, that we should all be perfect and we should all be operating. And it's that same kind of thing that you're talking about. if we never talk about the fact that we've upset somebody, or that somebody doesn't like something we've done, or doesn't like us in that moment in time, or that we've had a complaint about us, because if we've had a complaint about us, or somebody's not liking something we've said, that other person will be experiencing that same kind of thing at some point in their life, even if it's not in the terms of a formal complaint. There will be something there. And what struck me about what you said, about what happened to you, Anna, how challenging it must have been, because it was anonymous. You didn't have that opportunity to engage that question in an active way. You could think it, you could have that mindset, but you were stifled from actually being able to understand more and have that conversation where you could both connect as human beings and understand more fully that person's perspective, and maybe that person understand your perspective in that situation, because you were kind of shut down from doing that. And that can then leave us not necessarily stuck in that place, but it can leave us in that place longer than maybe we might want to be.
Yeah.
And that must have been really hard. I know, I'm very grateful for the brilliant feedback I get from people who attend my courses, but occasionally it won't work for somebody. They're not in a place, or it's triggered something for them that they're not ready to go there. And I will struggle if I get a comment and it's on because I allow people to do them anonymously, so they have that freedom and transparency to say whatever they want. But I instantly want to be able to follow that up and say, are you okay? Is there something you need to share with me? Is there something I can learn from this? And I'm not able to do that. And so I find that harder to process than if I was able to do it.
Well, I mean, there's just a lot to this, isn't there? We show up at work and we think that we're doing a job and we're going through a set of to-dos and we're taking some actions and we're creating a result. And actually, we're just bumping into each other's emotions all day, every day, and trying to manage that human aspect of our work very often without the training to back it up. So we may have the technical training, we may have the know-how. I know how to draft this contract. I know how to perform this operation. I know how to create this billing system. But do I know how to understand, recognize, deal with my own emotions, understand, recognize, and deal with the emotions of other people? I mean, I feel like we're fumbling our way in this regard.
Yeah, I think we are. And I think the workplace has a lot of catching up to do in terms of providing coaching such as yourself, providing training, providing those support networks. They're there in theory, they're there in mission statements, but they're not always there in practice. And even when they are, they're not always there in a way that we can access without feeling that we're the only one, or embarrassed, or weak, or that we failed in some way because we're the one needing to access some support. And sometimes people don't even recognize when their well-being's on the floor, and so they're absorbing more and more and carrying on and not even recognizing that actually they were at breaking point 3 months ago, and that they are literally limping their way through. And it's strange for me to say I'm thankful for what happened in my life in regards to Sophie, because how can one ever say that, because I would give anything for her to have her life back. But I'm grateful that it's given me, if I couldn't change it, I'm grateful that it's given me the ability to recognize now when my well-being's dropping, because it's dropped several times over my life, that I now recognize those signs and I can take the action that I need to do, and that now I class as something that I'm really grateful for, despite how it turned up. But we all will have traumas of some description in our life, won't we? And us, just with that emotional library, they're just wrapped up in a different book.
And I think that it's the same for our professional lives. We will all fall.
Yeah.
We'll all end up on the floor, maybe multiple times. We'll all fall and make a mistake and maybe have a complaint made. We'll all fall in our personal life and end up in a situation where we're like, how on earth did I get here?
Yeah.
And I think the way in the past was to cover that up, as you say, to get to the school gate and say, yeah, I'm having a great morning. When inside you're like, my kids won't put on their shoes. So if today in this podcast, we've reassured anyone that falling in all those regards is normal and a normal part of a human life, and actually maybe a rich part of a human life, then I think we've done our job.
Absolutely. And I think being able to share that with somebody else as well, recognizing if you're feeling it, chances are somebody else is too, because if we can share that, we'll often hear that message easier from a friend, from a colleague, than we will necessarily from our internal voice. So why we need to really work on our internal voice, support each other to do that, because we are all going through something at some point or another.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Carolyn, for being with us. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure the people listening to the podcast will have enjoyed it too. Is there anything else you want to leave us with?
Just a thank you, really. It's really nice to be able to I like-minded conversations, but where there's that level of interest and challenge and honesty and transparency. So I want to thank you for your openness, sharing your vulnerability, and inviting me to be part of it and to chat via you to your listeners of this podcast, and for getting this message out there, and hopefully some openness for other people to talk about it too. That's
Great.
the key, isn't it?
Yeah. And if people want to find you, I will leave a link to you and your details in the show notes. But where should somebody find you? Where do you hang out?
So the best place to contact me is via my website, which obviously you'll put the link on there, and do send a message to me. I'm on LinkedIn as well, and X. Yeah, if you want to put those links in, that's absolutely fine. But happy just to for anybody to share anything at all. I've just set up actually, Anna, something called Empathy Envoys, which is to support people to spread the message in the way that we've talked about within organizations. So I've got a page that's not quite live yet, but I could send you the link to that maybe.
Mm-hmm.
If people are interested in that, and on there you can actually nominate colleagues who you think are really doing something pretty special at work, people's appreciation of it. So that would be great. Find me that way would be brilliant.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thanks, Anna.
Confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident. Confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident at work.